Good morning and welcome to our press conference for the release of our landmark report, Net Zero by 2050, a roadmap for the global energy sector. My name is Jad Mawad. I'm the head of communications at the International Energy Agency. This morning we're presenting the findings of one of our most important reports, which maps a pathway for the energy sector to meet ambitious climate goals. This is a report that was announced by our executive director during President Biden's Clean Energy Summit. We will be hearing from our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol, as well as from Laura Cotti, our Chief Energy Modeler, and from Timur Gul, the head of our Energy Technology Perspectives Unit, who are the two main co-authors of the report. After the presentations and following a short break, we will open the floor to your questions. Journalists on the Zoom should send their questions through the Q&A box. The event will last about 45 minutes and we will strive to take as many questions as possible. Final reminder, this event is being live streamed and you can find the full report as well as the data on our website at iea.org. And with that, I would like to turn the floor to our Executive Director, Dr. Fatih Birol. Thank
you. Many thanks, Jad, and greetings to all the colleagues, all the friends following this event. Greetings from the IEA headquarters in Paris. So before listening the results of our, in my view, landmark report from the leaders of this report, Mrs. Laura Cotti, who is our Chief Energy Modeler, and Dr. Timur Gul, who is the leading our technology work and the head of the division for energy technology perspectives, I wanted to briefly tell you three things. Why we decided, and why and when, I should say, decided to make this report, number one. Number two, what is the aim of this report? And number three, I want to give you some of the findings that I thought are important to underline. And as I said, my colleagues, Mrs. Cotti and Mr. Gul, will go into some of the key findings. Now, at the IEA, dear colleagues, we look at the entire energy sector. Every day, electricity, coal, renewables, new technologies, hydrogen, nuclear power, efficiency, all of them. And when we look all of them, we see some very encouraging developments as far as the clean energy, as far as our climate goals are concerned. What are those? We just published our renewables update. Again, record number of solar PV panels, wind going very strongly, record after another. Again, under Dr. Gül's leadership, we published a report on the status of the electric cars, huge sales record. These are good numbers. This is one, which makes us happy. Second, at the IEA, we work with almost every government around the world, both advanced economies and the developing countries, and we follow their policies closely. And we are very happy to note that many governments now are making commitments to bring their emissions to net zero by 2050. Very encouraging, those commitments. This is also good news, on top of the good news coming from some clean energy applications. But at the IEA, we believe in numbers. Our numbers, unfortunately, show that, as we have published only a few weeks ago, this year, global emissions will increase substantially, which is the second largest increase in the history. So therefore, my colleague Jad mentioned, as I mentioned also at Mr. President Biden's summit, there is a growing gap between the rhetoric we hear from governments, industry leaders, and what is happening in the real life. We hear a lot of commitments, a lot of pledges, but the numbers, emissions are going up. So therefore, we thought we are going to come up with a study that provides a roadmap for the global energy sector to bring the emissions to net zero by 2050, and what needs to happen and when do they have to happen in the energy sector, so that one can easily compare government actions with that roadmap and the milestones we have set. Last year, 2020, in our two flagship publications, World Energy Outlook and Energy Technology Perspectives, we have already made special cases and analysis on this 1.5 degrees future to understand our modeling capabilities, data, and how we can make a world, energy world, which is compatible with 1.5. And again, last September, only 8 months, some 8 months ago, I hope Timur, Lara, you don't mind if I say, I have invited Timur and Lara to my office and said, now I would like to come up with a full scenario to show the world a pathway how we can bring the global energy sector to net zero 2050. Let's look at this. And I am thankful to both of my colleagues, Laura and Timur, for with their teams, and some of them are with us today, in 8 months of time, making a heroic work and came up with this landmark report. And this, it meant to bringing the modeling capabilities of World Energy Outlook and Energy Technology Perspectives. And they work with several organizations, link their modeling capabilities with the International Monetary Fund for economic consequences, YESA, who are colleagues who are experts in the bioenergy, among others. I am also thankful more than 100 peer reviewers, scientists, academicians, the data colleagues, and experts around the world. So, when I look at the results today, the first question I ask myself, as we get also from different colleagues, is it possible that the global energy sector, which is fossil fuel dominated today, 80% comes from fossil fuel, in 2050 comes to a net zero? The report, when I look at the report, I can summarize as follows. This pathway is a narrow one, it's a narrow pathway, but still achievable if the governments take bold and immediate action. What those actions are, I will, and Mrs. Kozy and Dr. Ag will come in a few minutes. But before going to energy, one again about the governments, about the countries around the world. Our UK colleagues find a good name for those efforts, Race to Zero. It's a good one. And what I would like to say, first of all, is that this race, different countries start this race from different starting points. There is a difference between the rich countries and the emerging countries. I want to note that as our report notes. This is number one. Number two, the race is not between the countries, but the race is against the time today when you look at our numbers. And third, unless all the governments finishes the race, nobody can win. So therefore, a key topic of our study is the critical importance of international cooperation in the fight against climate change. So, dear colleagues, when we look at our numbers, I see our report, I see three big homework for all of us, governments, industry, citizens, academia. Number one, to make the most out of the existing clean energy options. What are those? I mentioned solar, which we crowned a couple of months ago as the new king of electricity markets. Solar, wind, onshore wind, offshore wind, energy efficiency, electric cars, in some countries, nuclear power. So these are the first group of available technologies that we have to make the most out of. We don't use them as much as we should. We should use them much more compared to what we have today, and my colleagues will show the order of magnitude there. So this is one homework. Make the most out of the existing ones. Number two, why we do that, in parallel, we need to push the magic button of innovation. Because today, in addition to those technologies, we need other technologies to help us, especially around and after 2030, to reduce the emissions, such as advanced battery technologies, different hydrogen applications, or direct air capture. So there are many technologies that we need to incentivize governments and others to make them ready for the market. Those technologies are today under development, but we have to make them ready for the market. And the third, we have to reduce the use of fossil fuels substantially. So three jobs. One, make the most out of the existing clean energy options. Second, innovate the technologies under development, use them especially for the industry sector, long-haul transportation, aviation, shipping, and others. And third, reduce fossil fuel use. How this will happen? It will happen through, again, as it happened in the past, investments. Today, as we speak now, the world global energy investments for coal, oil, renewables, electricity, gas, for everything is about $2 trillion US. And this 2 trillion needs to go to 5 trillion by 2030. And not only that, today investment numbers are dominated by fossil fuels, and 2030 it should be dominated by clean energy options. So historical search for investments is needed to make this transformation in our energy system. And we looked whether or not these changes are going to have a negative or positive impact on the economy and on the jobs issue. I mentioned we work with IMF, And what we have found out, working with the IMF colleagues, is that this surge in historical surge we hope to see from 2 trillion to 5 trillion leads to an additional 0.4 percentage point annual increase in the global GDP. So global GDP each year will grow an additional 0.4 percentage point, which is, as many of us know, a big deal. This is number one. Number two, on the jobs front, the huge expansion in the clean energy creates jobs. Solar panels, electrification, the networks, the energy efficiency, construction, buildings, manufacturing, and we calculate that this altogether make about 30 million additional jobs created. But at the same time, we also see that about 5 million jobs are lost, especially those who are dealing with the fossil fuel production or technologies related to fossil fuel use. And this is a major concern for us because we believe clean energy is for and about people. And in our report, we have made some recommendations to governments how they can address this issue, which is, in our view, critical. So, dear colleagues, how does the energy security, which is a core mission of the IEA, affected from that? We see that the oil demand, which is about 90 million barrels per day today, talking about oil, will go down to 24 million barrels per day. And as the price of oil also goes down, this production will be coming big time from the low-cost producers, most of them being in Middle East, and the share of those countries, a few number of countries, in the global oil supply will increase at historical levels. We also see that the revenues of the Middle East countries, Russia and Nigeria, those countries whose economies are relying heavily, if not exclusively, on the oil and gas revenues, will go down substantially. On a per capita basis, income, oil and gas income will go down about 75%, which in turn may have significant economic and social consequences if those countries do not diversify their economies in a timely manner. Last 2 points from me. Global energy system, how does it look like in 2050 if the governments follow the roadmap we have announced, we are announcing, in fact, today? When we look at today's energy system, it is dominated by fossil fuels. As I said, 80% of the energy comes from fossil fuels. In the year 2050, IEA's roadmap comes up with a completely different picture, which is dominated by clean energy. If I have to give you one example, solar, the share of solar in the total energy today is about 1%, and it will go up in 2050 in our pathway to 20%, and as such, solar in 2050 becomes the single largest source of global energy mix. Wind, hydrogen, they will be dominating the global energy mix in the year 2050 in our roadmap. So, dear colleagues, let me finish by one of the, in my view, important aspects of our work, namely, we are a pragmatic organization. We came up with more than 400 milestones, what the governments need to do and when do they have to do it so that we can reach our climate targets, 1.5 degrees Celsius. More than 400, as I said, and this would help us to track the government's decisions, developments, whether or not countries are on or off track vis-à-vis their targets. I will give you a couple of milestones that our report comes up. One of them is, given the big decline in oil, gas, and coal, as of this year, there is no need for new fossil fuel supply investments, oil, gas, and coal. Second, as of this year, no more unabated coal-fired power plants built around the world. Another one, in the year 2035, no new sales of internal combustion engine cars, the cars that which are dominating our streets today. As of 2035, no more sales of these cars. 2040, global power system in net terms becomes carbon free. So these are some of the milestones of our work, and these are, again, we put them so that we don't only make a 2050 what needs to happen, or as it is the case nowadays in social media sending tweets left and right. We wanted to make, as it is a tradition in the IEA, a rigorous analysis, pragmatic suggestions, even though the challenge is very, very high. And we are working with a few governments, and we will be working with more and more governments to help them on the basis of this expertise we have built at the IEA to draw their national roadmaps, we hope are in line with the 1.5 degrees target that we all, I hope, all of us commit to. With this, I would like now turn to my colleague, Laura Cosi, and I would like to, in front of you, dear colleagues, friends following us, once again, I would like to thank my colleagues, Laura Cosi, Timur Gül, and the entire huge team of experts finishing this study in 8 months of time, which is a record for such an in-depth study. Thank you very much, and over to you, Laura.
Thank you very much, Dr. Birol, and it's my pleasure with Dr. Gül to go through the key findings of the report. Let me start with just giving you a visual impression of where we sit in terms of comparison with comparable IPCC 1.5 scenarios that have been really one of our key comparison points throughout the course of the development of the study since September last year. Well, what you can see here is the following. The levers that we use are broadly similar, but there are some important differences in terms of levers that we use more and levers that we use a bit less. Let me start with maybe discussing carbon dioxide removal. We are among the lowest use across comparable IPCC scenarios, very similar in terms of utilization of carbon capture, utilization and storage, and certainly the lowest in terms of bioenergy use. On the other side, we are gonna, our roadmap, our pathway uses more electrification, more solar and wind, and more hydrogen. So this is really a bit of a nutshell. What are the key levers that we are using to reach net zero by 2050? But as the executive director mentioned at the very beginning of his speech, we really find that the pathway to net zero is narrow but still feasible. And why do we say that? We look at the next 10 years, the next decade. The next decade, we call it really the decade of massive clean energy expansion. But the good news is that the 13 gigaton emission reduction that the energy sector needs to achieve from now to 2030, well, we have all the technologies that we need to cut emissions by 13 gigatons. And the good news is that most of them are here, are on the market, are cheaper than the alternative. Who needs to lead the way? It's the power sector. Electricity generation, as the executive director mentioned earlier, gets to net zero first by 2030, 40. What do we need? We need a huge push of solar and wind. 2020 was a record year. We installed globally 250 gigawatts. What we need to do is to quadruple this by 2030. Quadrupling is something that the solar and wind industry is accustomed to. It's what they have achieved last decade. So we need to replicate the quadrupling we have achieved last decade, this decade, of course, to much greater volumes. As the electricity sector decarbonizes very quickly, electricity becomes carbon-free. And if we use it in our homes, if we use it in our cars, of course, the global economy decarbonizes faster. So here we take the example of cars. Our latest data of the first quarter of 2021, so January to March 2021, globally, 6% of cars sold were electric vehicles. Where do we need to get? We need to get to around 60% sales by 2030. Some of our countries around the globe have achieved similar shares, so we need to replicate these at global level. Looking at what car manufacturers are doing around the globe today, over the past couple of years, there has been a really increasing and huge amount of the spectrum of cars that are electric, that are on the market. But when we sum them all up, actually, we are not quite there in terms of volume that we would need by 2030. We would need roughly to double the amount of electric vehicles and the plans that we see now in the pipeline from major car manufacturers. The other big push that we need to make in this decade is energy efficiency. From our agency, very consistently, we are always saying energy efficiency first. It's the case also to achieve 1.5 degrees. This decade, we need to accelerate on energy efficiency. The rate of improvement the global economy needs to see year on year from now on, it's 4% a year. This can be a bit an elusive number, but it's very clear that has key implications in our daily lives. For example, in the building sector, it would mean that 1 in every 5 buildings needs to be retrofitted. We need to have it much more efficient to need less energy to heat or cool. We look at policies around the world today, they're not quite there yet. Only more or less 1 in 20 buildings is set to be retrofitted over the next decade. So we have the technologies, we know how to retrofit buildings, we just need to make it sure that there is the policies, there is the incentive to roll out this very quickly. Another example, LED lights. By 2025, light bulbs that we sell around the planet should all be LEDs. Now, it's clear that this huge clean energy push comes with consequences, has translation consequences for fossil fuel alternatives. Dr. Birol mentioned this already in his opening remarks. If you look at the electricity sector, as of now, we need no new unabated coal plants approved for development. We would need no more sale of fossil fuel boilers. And again, for cars, this would mean that by 2035, we would need no more sales of internal combustion engine. What's the lever, as Dr. Birol mentioned, is really investment. As Dr. Birol actually pre-announced at the Biden summit, if you look at only clean energy investment, what we need from now to 2030 is a tripling of the volume of investment. Electricity sector is one of the biggest recipients here. In particular, solar and wind would come with no surprise given the numbers we have shown earlier. By 2030, we would have a volume of investment of around 1.3 trillion. This is larger than the fossil fuel industry has ever seen. Energy investment in the next 2-3 years would surpass the highest level that the energy sector has ever seen. It's important to note here that it's not only investment in terms of buying a new car or installing a solar plant. Here we need to build at the same time the critical infrastructure that would enable then this energy to flow and emission reductions to be materialized. What are we talking about here? For example, electricity grids. Crucial. We are seeing a growth in electricity demand from now to 2030 of 40%, huge increase of solar and wind. We can only use this electricity, produce this electricity, if grids expands very significantly. At the same time, we need to install a lot of EV recharging stations, and we need to get ready for the next phase of emission reductions. For example, building ports that can export and utilize actually hydrogen. So this huge boost and unprecedented level of clean energy investment and infrastructure would lead to a boost in economic growth. This analysis we were very pleased to do in collaboration with the International Monetary Fund, as we have done last year for the Sustainable Recovery Report. And what we find is that you would get every single year from now to 2030 a 0.4 percentage points increase than otherwise. So to give a sense of scale, it would mean that by 2030, the economy would be larger by the equivalent of adding another economy the size of Japan. So it's very significant, very, very significant economic growth pushed by those clean energy investments. The good news is that with those wave of investments would come jobs, and many of it. Today, the global energy supply industry employs around 40 million workers all around the world. This big push would bring new jobs, mostly in the electricity sector, 14 million new workers. There are jobs at risk at the same time, and we need to pay particular attention for those. Dr. Birol said it already earlier, this clean energy transition has to be for and about people. It means that those communities, those regions that rely currently on revenues, employment from coal, from oil, we need to pay particular attention to those. One important point is that some of the skills the workers have, for example, in coal mining today, could be applied to parts of the energy transition that are booming. One example is critical minerals mining, lithium. So we could, with appropriate policies, if their geographical location permits, to transfer, reskill those workers and make sure that the job losses are not as large as we could see. Similarly, for oil and gas, workers that are working in engineering, offshore oil and gas fields could be transferred in the booming offshore wind industry. The new jobs are not only in clean energy supply, they're also in clean energy end uses. We have mentioned already electric vehicles, we have mentioned buildings retrofit, we have mentioned more efficient appliances. All of those together create a pipeline of new workers of around 16 million. So in total, we'll be able to generate in a decade 30 million new jobs. Now, do we have the skills ready for this pipeline of new workers? We are seeing that actually it's not necessarily quite the case. We need to have a push and acceleration. So governments need to put in place the trainings, the vocational programs, the reskillings needed to go towards a much higher and medium level of skills to be able to reap the fruits of this booming job creation. And with this, I would pass the floor to Dr. Gul. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Birol, and thank you, Ms. Cosi, and also a warm welcome from my end to today's press conference for the launch of our landmark report, Net Zero Emissions by the year 2050. As Ms. Cosi already mentioned in the beginning of her speech, and also Dr. Birol highlighted, we basically have all the technologies ready and available in the market to make the significant reductions that we need from the energy sector in terms of CO2 emissions by the year 2030 to stay on track towards net zero CO2 from the energy sector by the year 2050. From energy efficiency to renewables, from renewables to electric cars and many more, we have the means to cut emissions from the global energy sector. But what we are highlighting in our report is that the full transition to net zero emissions by the year 2050 will require more technology efforts than that. We need to decarbonize more than the power sector. We need to decarbonize more than electric cars. We need to do more than just making our way of consuming energy more efficient. We will need to tackle emissions also in various different other parts of the energy system, including long-distance transport, such as planes, ships, heavy-duty trucks, or the various different industries, heavy industries in particular, cement production, iron and steel production, chemical industry, and many, many more. In these kind of sectors, we know the technologies that can help the full decarbonization, but we don't have them in the market today as yet ready to be scaled. Many of these technologies are today still at demonstration or even prototype stage, and by the year 2050, almost half of the emission savings for achieving net zero emissions by that time will need to come from technologies, such technologies that are currently under development. We need to bring them into the market. So what are these kind of technology options? They broadly fall into four main categories. That's technologies to help enable electrification of end users. It's technologies for carbon capture, utilization and storage. It's technologies for the production and use of hydrogen. And it's sustainable bioenergy technologies as well. You see a couple of options here. Advanced battery designs, for example, that can provide a step change in energy density and help enable not only the electrification of heavy-duty trucks, but also short-distance ships and possibly even short-distance flights. We will need to successfully demonstrate CO2 capture in the cement industry to address process emissions. We'll need to look at carbon dioxide removal technologies, such as direct air capture, for example, both to offset residual emissions that are still there and therefore help to advance the date of net zero emissions, but also to help produce synthetic fuels for aviation. Hydrogen, as I mentioned, another key area where we are making great progress in many areas, but we need to bring several technologies, in particular on the demand side, into the market. Hydrogen-based steel making is one such example. It is important to recognize that the deployment of the technologies that we have today in the market and innovating on the technologies that we don't quite yet have fully in the market, these are not antagonists in the fight against climate change. They are actually two sides of the same coin. This decade, and this is the message that comes from our report, this decade must be both the time of accelerated deployments of the technologies that we have and the time of accelerated innovation to prepare the next generation of clean energy technologies towards a net zero transition by 2050. For governments, we have identified two key aspects here that I would like to bring to your attention. First, we need to increase investment in demonstration projects. Our analysis shows that roughly $90 billion need to be mobilized as soon as possible to complete a portfolio of demonstration projects before the year 2030. And this compares with roughly $25 billion that have been budgeted today. And second, we need to bring international cooperation to a new height, accelerating innovation, developing international standards, coordinating to scale up technologies in such a way that links the national market. Our analysis that we are bringing forward in the report actually shows that without such heightened, strengthened international cooperation on innovating in these kind of technologies, in these critical sectors, will mean, without such international collaboration, will mean that we reach net zero emissions decades later than 2050. Let us now turn to energy security, which of course can improve through decarbonizing and domestic sourcing of energy, but it should also be very clear to all of us that if the road to net zero emissions ignores energy security, then it will be a longer and more challenging pathway. What we are seeing in our projections in our net zero 2050 pathway is not that we are getting out of oil and gas entirely, but we are seeing a significant drop in oil and gas demand. And the result is that no new oil and natural gas fields are approved for development in this pathway. The result of this reaction is that supplies become increasingly concentrated in a small number of low-cost producers. And for oil, the result is that the share of OPEC, of what is a much reduced global oil supply, grows from today 34% to 52% by the year 2050, which is a level that is higher than at any point in the history of oil markets. A second important area of security to be mindful of is that we will require substantial quantities of critical minerals through the scale-up of clean energy technologies such as wind, solar PV, batteries. All these require larger quantities of minerals than we are using today. Minerals like copper, cobalt, manganese, and various rare earth metals. We have put out a report on the role of critical minerals just last week, and we find here that in our net zero pathway, already by 2030, the demand for these minerals is seven-fold higher than today. The point here is that current production and processing for many of these minerals is more geographically concentrated than is the case of for oil and natural gas, and so this could create new energy security concerns which need to be addressed heads-on, of course. Finally, there are potential new vulnerabilities associated with the need to maintain reliable, flexible, and secure electricity systems. In our scenario, electricity becomes the largest source of final energy demand by the year 2050. Additional electricity needs come from the production of low-carbon hydrogen, hydrogen-derived fuels, and at the same time, the share of solar PV and wind rises to almost 70% by the year 2050. The result is, as you see here, that the need for electricity system flexibility about quadruples towards 2050, with the sources of flexibility shifting away from unabated fossil fuels that are retired towards demand-side response, battery storage systems, and dispatchable low-emission sources from hydropower to hydrogen to plants that are equipped with CCUS. Naturally, with the increasing importance of electricity for the energy sector, and not only for our buildings, but also transport, industries, etc., there's also a need to enhance the resilience of electricity systems to other emerging threats, such as cybersecurity. What our report presents in detail is a pathway to net zero emissions by the year 2050, and we are seeing an increasing number of governments and companies making their own plans for reaching net zero emissions in the long term. Some earlier than 2050, some later. These are all excellent efforts, of course, but net zero pledges have to come, of course, with intermediate policies, intermediate milestones that are achieved along the way. In our pathway, we identify many such milestones for technology innovation, for technology deployment, for policy. Ms. Cosi already mentioned a number of them. We have actually set out more than 400 such milestones at a global level in our report that are the outcome of our scenario analysis. It is, of course, important here to recognize that this is a global analysis, and every country has its own circumstances, will make its own plans for the transition to net zero emissions depending on its own priorities and preferences. But our milestones that we are setting out will hopefully give a sense of the pace and scale involved with a global transition to net zero emissions. Let me highlight, there are more than 400, many more than you see here on this particular slide, but let me highlight 3 of them that are particularly interesting, I believe. First one is about hydrogen, which is set to become an increasingly important part of our energy mix on the road to net zero emissions by 2050. Already in 2030, low-carbon hydrogen supplies become 150 million tons from next to nothing today. The production of these low-carbon hydrogen supplies brings about a huge jump in electrolyzer capacity. We have roughly 250 megawatt of electrolyzers installed today. In our net zero emission pathway, already by the year 2030, these 250 megawatt of today jump to 850 gigawatt, so a factor of more than 3,000 larger over the next 10 years, which may sound daunting, of course, is clearly ambitious. But when you look at the project pipeline, according to our numbers, we could already be at 110 gigawatts by the year 2030, only on the basis of the project pipeline that we are measuring today. But what this means is, essentially, it's still a factor 8 difference roughly between what has to be achieved and what is in the project pipeline. What it means is that electrolyzers, as many other technologies, need to repeat the history of scaling up ambition that we have seen for solar PV and more recently with electric cars, month after month and year after year, in order to reach net zero emissions in the long run. Second, we have mentioned the power sector already, and Ms. Cosi mentioned that it's the first largest sector that decarbonizes entirely in our projections. We have many technologies, practically all of them available to decarbonize electricity generation. By the year 2040, net zero emissions from the global electricity sector is reached in our net zero 2050 pathway, and as early as 2035 overall in advanced economies. Finally, as mentioned earlier, renewables become the dominant source of electricity generation in our net zero emission pathway. By the year 2050, about 90% of electricity generation come from renewables and 70% from solar PV and wind alone. I would like to conclude our presentation by saying that we perfectly acknowledge, of course, that our scenario is a pathway and not the pathway to net zero emissions by the year 2050. We have analyzed a couple of other such pathways in our report, looking at some of the key uncertainties from bioenergy to CCS to behavior and others. We do hope, though, that our report, with the details, the pragmatic recommendations that it sets out will inform and stimulate the debate on how our collective climate goals can be achieved in practice. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Timur. Thank you very much, Laura, for this excellent presentation. We are now going to be taking some questions. We will take a 2-minute break while we collect the questions. And because there's a lot of interest in the report, we have a lot of questions coming in. We will extend this press conference so we can answer as many questions as possible. Just to note as well that the report is available online. The slides are available online, so you can dig into the report on our website as well. So we'll take a 2-minute break and we'll be right back. Thank you. Welcome back to the Q&A portion of our presentation. We have a number of questions. I will read them by three and distribute them to our speakers. The first question we received is, we'll go to Laura Coetzee. Laura, how much do you rely on bioenergy in your scenario, and are there large impacts on land? The second question I will direct to Timur. Number of questions basically on the same topic, which is what happens if oil and gas supply does not fall in line with demand? And the third question to our executive director, again, a question that we've been getting a lot. Will the new net zero 2050 scenario be part of the World Energy Outlook this year? Laura, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Jad. So bioenergy is one area where we really benefited quite a lot from the review process. We currently have around, this is a bit technical, so I apologize, around 100 exajoules of bioenergy used in 2050. What is this bioenergy used for? Is, for example, biogases produced from waste that we use to decarbonize, especially in the 2030s, gas in the grids. We use also some bioenergy to create some small but important negative emissions from the, for example, from the power sector, to make sure that sectors that are more difficult to abate, the ones that Dr. Gul mentioned earlier, aviation, for example, have a little more time to deploy and adjust to the low carbon transition. Two important points that I would like to analyze in terms of our bioenergy numbers there. So they are the lowest when we compare to IPCC scenarios. There is no increase in cropland use for bioenergy production in our net zero pathway, and no bioenergy crops are developed on forest land. Important considerations why? Because of the potential conflicts with food production and to ensure that biodiversity is not lost. Before going back and giving the floor to Dr. Gul, I would like to acknowledge here, as Dr. Birol did earlier, but big thanks from all of us really to our partners at IASA who have helped us develop this analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. So second question to Timur, please.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jet, and excellent question. Of course, I think it's important, first of all, to recognize what we have said in our report. We are saying in our report that a net zero emission pathway towards the year 2050 does not require additional new oil or gas fields beyond those that are already approved for development, so no new investment in these kind of areas. As Dr. Birol already highlighted at the beginning of our press conference, there is a gap between rhetoric and real life. We are currently not on track towards achieving this outcome, which obviously means for oil and gas producers, how do they interpret the guidance of our net zero 2050 roadmap and the market signals that that they are receiving. The report also analyzes government pledges that have been announced so far all around the world to reach net zero emissions, and if all of them are being taken fully into account, then they don't align yet with net zero by the year 2050. We actually have 20 gigatons, more than 20 gigatons of emissions still left, and actually an oil demand that is 3 times higher than in our net zero 2050 pathway. So in our view, we need to be looking carefully at the possibility of overproduction of hydrocarbons, and we need to recognize the risks that are on the other side. An orderly transition means that producers need to follow the market closely and respond in the necessary way.
Thank you very much, Timur. And this third question for Dr. Birol, a question we've been getting a lot that you've addressed already in the LinkedIn article. Will this net zero scenario be part of the WEO 2021?
Thank you, Jet. Before that, if I may just add to the answer of Dr. Gül on the fossil fuel supply investments. They are not anymore required. Why? Answer is very simple. This is the governments around the world committed to net zero by 2050. What we are doing at the IEA, using our expertise on the energy sector, all the data at the IEA at our fingertips, and we just translate those targets set in 2050 to the real life. What does it mean for additional oil, gas, and coal production? And therefore, we came up with the finding that if the world wants to be compatible with the net zero 2050 target, there is no need additional new fossil fuel supply investments for oil, gas, and coal. And coming back to World Energy Outlook, World Energy Outlook has been and still is some colleagues call it the Bible of global energy, and it has always provided, or tried to provide, I should say, timely information to policymakers, and this is the reason why it made the World Energy Outlook is the most credible energy book of the world. And once again, as I mentioned, as my colleague Mr. Muwaz said, I wrote in I think it was last week, Jet, that on a LinkedIn article, that the net zero report, what we have presented to the world today, will be an integral part of many of the IEA work, including the World Energy Outlook 2021. Thank you.
Many thanks, Dr. Birol, for this very clear answer. We have a number of questions still coming up. I will read another round. Perhaps I'll read 4 this time. First question I will address to Timur about methane, another topic that the IEA has studied extensively. The question is, if fossil fuel demand is falling, is there still a need to reduce methane emissions? Second question I will address to Laura, which is, what is the burden on governments or citizens to achieve net zero by 2050? And then 2 questions for Dr. Birol. The first one on India from Henry Edwards-Evan from Platts. What has India conveyed in setting up its NDCs to cut emissions? And then perhaps the last question, if I can just put them all together. It's from Klaus Amann from Swiss Radio. What makes you positive that governments switch from pledging to acting soon? A very topical last question. So Timur, first question to you, please.
Yeah, thank you, Jad. Excellent question. Now, putting things a bit in perspective, the focus of this scenario is on net zero emissions from energy production and use and industrial processes, net zero CO2 emissions by the year 2050. Why? Because the energy sector is responsible for roughly 90% of global CO2 emissions, total CO2 emissions, and in addition is responsible or as a result is responsible for 3/4 of total greenhouse gas emissions. Now, methane is of course a very potent greenhouse gas with significant climate temperature impacts, in particular in the near term. And so we have included measures to address methane emissions from oil, coal, and gas in this scenario, additionally to the CO2 emissions measures that we have adopted. What we find in our scenario is that methane emissions from fossil fuels fall by around 75% over the next 10 years to 2030, equivalent to roughly reducing 2.5 gigatons of CO2 equivalent reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. This is not only because of the reduction in coal, oil, and gas use. In fact, only 1/3 of this reduction, of this decline, is a result of falling fossil fuel consumption. The rest is coming, in our scenario, from technologies that help reducing these emissions, which are all available to the market, and they can lead to the complete elimination of all technically avoidable methane emissions by 2030.
Thank you very much, Timur. The second question was for Laura, the burden on governments or citizens to achieve net zero by 2050.
Thank you very much, Jad. Very clearly, governments are at the driving seat to achieve net zero by 2050, putting in place the right policies and making sure that the financing for the transition happens. But it's also very clear that without citizens' engagement, the transition will really simply not happen. So we have around 40% of the emission reductions that are needed to achieve net zero by 2050 that are stemming from decisions that industries can take, be it decarbonizing the power sector, so pushing solar and wind to decarbonize power, or building a clean steel mill. But there are another more than half emission reductions that require the involvement of citizens. In which way? The next car we will buy will have to be an electric vehicle, a cleaner car. We will need to start retrofitting our homes. We will need to start buying heat pumps. We will need to start buying very efficient air conditioners. So in all these choices, the citizens is active and plays a very crucial role. Clearly, government policies are needed. Why? Because of affordability reasons. While in this net zero pathway, our bills will go down in terms of the share in disposable income or remain flat, we will have to spend more at the upfront. So the governments are a critical role to make sure that there is the affordability issue solved in terms of spending more capital in the upfront. Third and final point on equity, we have addressed some of it at the outset of this presentation, explaining that advanced economies reach net zero a bit earlier than emerging economies, but there is also a question of the people that still lack access. It has to be a clear priority that by 2030, we make sure that with part of the solar and wind installations that we are installing go to make sure that the nearly 800 million people that don't have access to electricity today achieve this, to make sure that citizens are fully on board. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Laura, to emphasize particularly energy access and people-centered transitions, which are critical also topics for the IEA. Last two questions, Dr. Birol, for you. The first on India and India's NDCs, and perhaps the final one, how to get from government pledges to action.
Thank you, Jet. Just perhaps at what you just said, Jet and Laura, the people-centered clean energy transition, it is very important for the IEA, dear colleagues. We want these clean energy transitions to happen for the people, and this is about the people. So it is the reason, as my colleague Mr. Muwat mentioned, this year I convened a high-level group, which we call People-Centered Clean Energy Transitions, in order to provide suggestions to governments how we can deal with the issues come as a result of the clean energy transitions that would have negative implications for the workers, communities, and others. And I am very happy that the Prime Minister of Denmark is chairing this group, about 20 ministers, prime ministers, leaders around the world, which is going to provide a contribution to report to COP26. Now, coming back to the question of India, and I want to, first of all, I should say, we work very closely with Indian government, with all the relevant ministries and authorities, and supporting India on many fronts, from the renewable integration to energy efficiency of the air conditioners, from that to the decarbonization of the trucks and other issues. But what I would like to highlight is a bit different. From India to going to more the emerging world. I tried to mention at the beginning, this race to net zero, not all the countries start from the same starting point. And those countries who have more difficulties to have access to capital for their clean energy investments are those who also are going to be responsible bulk of the emissions growth in the future. So if the world cannot help support the emerging countries to mobilize clean energy investments and technologies to those countries. In addition to those countries, their own efforts, our chances to reach our climate goals will be very, very small, if at all possible, because big emissions growth coming from there. It is the reason in June we are coming yet another report, working with this time with World Bank and the World Economic Forum, how to finance clean energy investments in the emerging world, coming with some concrete suggestions there. It is the reason in this report that we have just presented, we see that the rich countries reach their climate targets a few years earlier than the emerging countries, and we hope that they support the developments in the emerging countries, India and others. Other question from Switzerland: what makes you positive that the governments switch from pledging to acting soon? Now, I think many governments we see encouraging signals. EU, UK, United States, soon Japan. I believe they are all going to put concrete plans, and we are working with those governments to support them to build their own credible energy policies to reach the net zero targets. This is because they have a moral obligation. This is number one. But there is other reason why I believe that the governments will go to action soon. Our report shows that the future energy industry is a modern one, is a clean one. I think none of the economists I mentioned and the others in Asia, Latin America, Africa, none of those governments want to have an energy system which is old, lagging behind what is happening in the other parts of the world, and lose a competitive advantage vis-à-vis others. So there is a other reason that the governments, I am sure, around the world will make will take steps to create the economies of the future, and they will send unmistakable signals to the investors that the clean energy options are the ones which will bring them lucrative returns. Finally, I would like to tell you that the report that my colleagues put together in this 8-9 months of time in a heroic manner, in my view, it's an excellent report, excellent pathway, but it is not the pathway. It is a pathway. I am sure countries, other colleagues may have different thoughts, different solutions, different suggestions, as they have different backgrounds. But we thought, as the world's leading energy authority, IEA has the responsibility to come up with the first comprehensive roadmap how to bring the global energy sector net zero by 2050. Thank you.
Dr. Birol, thank you very much. And this concludes our presentation for the launch of our Net Zero by 2050 report. I'd like to thank everyone for attending. If you have any more questions, we're getting more questions, please send them to press@iea.org. Clearly, this is a major report that will inform all our work this year, as Dr. Birol said, and beyond. Thank you for your attention.